Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to SIGA's Ramadan webinar series, Conversation with History. Today is April 29th, the 17th day of Ramadan. I'm very pleased today to have with us a great academic, a political analyst, an Arab thinker, a pioneer in the field of higher education and political science, Professor Shafeeq Ghabra. Dr. Al-Ghabra is from Kuwait of Palestinian descent. He's a professor of political science at Kuwait University and founding president of the organization Jusur Arabiya, meaning Arab Bridges. This organization focuses on youth leadership programs and strategic planning. He's also the former founding president of the American University of Kuwait between 2003 and 2006. He was also the director of the Kuwait Information Office in Washington between 1998 and 2002, which means that during 9/11, the tragic events, he was there in Washington, as well as the director of the Center for Strategic Studies at Kuwait University right after his stint in Washington. Dr. Al-Ghabra earned his bachelor's degree from Georgetown University in '75, his master's degree from Purdue University in '83, and his PhD again in political science from the University of Texas at Austin in 1987. He's the author of 5 books and many studies and papers. I'm also pleased and I'd like to welcome my co-host, Dr. Muhammad Makram Balawi. Dr. Balawi is a Palestinian writer and academic based in Istanbul. He holds a PhD in post-colonialist studies from International Islamic University in Malaysia. He recently published a book which was titled Deconstructing Pro-Israeli Discourse, India as a Case Study. Dr. Balawi is also the president of Asia Middle East Forum, a public diplomacy platform that advocates for the Palestinian cause in Asia. He's also the director of Al-Quds Foundation Malaysia branch and founder of Save Al-Quds Coalition, which has 40 Malaysian organizations as part of that coalition. He writes extensively on Asia and the Middle East in major Arab news outlets. So welcome, Professor Shafeeq, and welcome, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you. Thank you. Look forward.
Thank you, Dr. Sam.
I'd like to first ask you about, Dr. Shafeeq, about your early life. You were born, I think, in 1953, so within years of a Nakba. You also were born, of course, in Kuwait. Tell us about that early time period in your life, your education, how Kuwait was when you were born, growing up in the 50s and 60s, and tell us about those who influenced you during that early period, the values that shaped you, and how your views were evolved over the time.
That's a big topic, and it's a complex one. But
we need to know as much as we can in a short period of time about.
Born in Kuwait, 1953, to a Palestinian family that was ethnically cleansed from Palestine. Then my parents were not married in 1948. My father was a doctor in Haifa, a graduate of the AUB. And my mother was in Tiberias. And from Tiberias, where my grandfather then, from my mother's side, was a leading representative of the Palestinian cause in Tiberias. And it ended up that they met in Lebanon. And my father being a doctor, he had many doors open for him. And he, with my mother, decided to go to Kuwait, where I was born immediately a year after their arrival. And it was a very interesting era that Kuwait was just beginning to open up to the world, to develop the country.
It was still under British occupation at the time.
It was under British protection. It wasn't. It's a colonial situation, not independence. Kuwait will get its independence in 1961, so it was still a protectorate of Britain, and. That's where, but it had an autonomy to manage things within, and it decided that it wanted to bring as much as it can from the more talented Palestinians in education, in medicine, in electricity, in all kinds of walks of life. And it opened a program. It was the first Gulf country to open up and decide on a very ambitious program.
You know, I was born in Kuwait, and my father had the same situation 5 years later.
In fact, there isn't a Palestinian who has not passed through Kuwait. Even Ghassan Kanafani spent 6 years in Kuwait before deciding to leave and go after his nationalist Palestinian project. So Kuwait was a very central place in the Palestinian mindset immediately after 1948. And as I said, it's just beginning. So it means there's a lot of barren land, there is a lot of desert around me. And I was, and you're definitely limited to certain areas that you can be in. Everything was still in a construction. I mean, it was a construction site. It evolved like that in the 50s and 60s. However, my stay in Kuwait was interrupted, but positively interrupted for 3 years when my father decided to study in England and become a cardiologist. He specialized. So to go from Kuwait to England, then the difference is not like today. The differences could look much less, but then it was huge. You go to London, you live there for 3 years, and then here you are surrounded by theaters, parks, greenery.
How old were you at the time?
Hmm?
How old were you when you went to England?
I was 4.5, 5 years old. It made such an impression on me, that experience for 3 years until I became 7. I was in England. So you go to kindergarten. I then went to first grade in the UK. And so that was, and I think also being the eldest child of the family, I absorbed a lot of the political culture and political discussions around me. I mean, our salon, our sitting area in the house, whenever relatives come, it's only Palestine.
Well, Palestine.
We're ethnically cleansed from Haifa and Tiberias and Jaffa and Akka and Safad and all the villages of Palestine just a few years ago. So I absorbed that tremendously. And then going to London at a time when I was 5, and being an Arab in London when you are 5 in the late 50s, like 58, 59, 60, animosity towards an Arab was very high as well, even as a child. And I didn't see that in adults, but I saw it in children. So it really created my identity as an Arab in a place that's then influenced by the Suez attack and the war in 1956 and all the myths, you know, around Israel and the Arabs and Palestine. And it was so difficult for me whenever asked then, where are you from? I say, from Palestine, and you cannot show it on a map. There is no map then, because the maps were erased, and there were new maps that put Palestine erased, and the new map would say Israel, and then it would say Jordan, and then it will say Egypt, but it will not show Palestine. So identities, issue of identity became big in my upbringing. And after 3 years, I went back to Kuwait, spent 2 years in schools. And then my parents sent me to a boarding school, a Quakers boarding school in the mountains of Lebanon, in order to keep my English and to keep my good level of understanding and studying. Then Kuwait also was in the beginning of education. So I went to Brumana when I was almost just turning 9 and spent 3 years. Then back to Kuwait. You see, so it's and then back to Lebanon. I finished high school in Lebanon, Brumana, at the end before I come to the US. So it's very mixed. Now, I don't. Maybe you have a question, but I would like to mention here that going back and forth gave me so much. I mean, it's not easy. You suffer as a child when you're moving around, but you learn a lot, and it shapes your personality. And if you are resilient, then all that power will come out in your life, in your personality, in the way you are. But more important, Palestine was always a central issue for me. And maybe there were times it was less. I was teenaging, 13, 14. But I think the 67 war shocked us, my generation. You look, anybody born between the late 40s and the early 50s, this is a generation. This is a younger than other generations of Palestinians who were involved later or before. But this generation was shocked, and I was shocked. So I had, my teenaging was short-lived. It didn't last long. And then here I am, I become slowly in the high school in Kuwait, a member of the Fatah movement, the student groups. And slowly so at age 15, I get into that. And that's where I started reading, not only depending on what my parents told me and my relatives and my grandfather and everybody, but it's reading and getting educated and trying to articulate your ideas and testing them with people in discussions, wherever you are. And I think that motivated me to ask my parents to send me back to Lebanon, to the high school. So I was 16 in Lebanon in the high school. And it motivated me because in a summer school, they used to send us to summer schools at least. I realized how political is Lebanon, how intellectual it is. It's the readings, the books, the libraries, the way of life, the thinking, the culture, the openness, the diversity and the acceptance of different people. This will maybe go away in certain times later, but then it was an amazing place for someone like me at age 15 and a half, 16, wants to learn. So I go to Lebanon, and there I think I get much of my intellectual abilities extremely developed. Reading, going to Beirut, hearing lectures, reading, going to downtown Beirut for all these books, then going to South Lebanon and seeing the refugee camps for the first time of my life through my friends in the school who took me, and I stayed with them in Tyre in South Lebanon. And from there, I think something, electricity came in about what I should do with my life and how I could go about serving the cause of Palestine.
So it wasn't just stories told you. You had an experience also in Lebanon with refugees, with their stories, with what's happening.
Exactly. But, I mean, instead of partying in the weekends, which I would do once in a while, I would go to South Lebanon and see Palestine from there, and get to see the villages, the southern Lebanese people. I kind of connected and created an affinity. And it will have a big impact on my life.
To Dr. Makram, I just wanted to say a word or two about the rise of Nasserism at the time. You know, while you're growing up, Nasser, of course, became a phenomenon. Arab nationalism became basically the ideology that many people identified with. And then you were in Kuwait, you know, where there was, yes, there was some autonomy there, but also the regimes in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia were a little wary about these fervors. Tell us about that and what kind of feelings you had.
The question is for me, correct? Or to Dr. Mohammed?
No, I said before he gives you his question. I'm asking that question and the next to him.
Yeah, sure.
So basically, Arab nationalism was the trend. And even at my parents' house, whenever friends came, Arab nationalism, Nasserism, Baathism, all these were the trends, the political movements of the time. Keep in mind that the movement of Arab nationalism, of Arab nationalists, Harakat al-Qawmiyin al-Arab, was founded by like George Habash and Hani al-Hindi and Wadi Haddad. But more important, maybe from a different dimension, is to realize that there is a leading Kuwaiti involved in that formation. He is Dr. Ahmed Khatib. And that is very telling that this movement had a grassroots reality in Kuwait. And therefore, it was, in quote unquote, the opposition then, different than today's opposition, which is more the Islamic and countryside based. That was urban and schooled in AUB and schooled in the Levant area. So Arab nationalism had a big impact. Nasser was a huge figure. And Kuwait was able to find a way in the middle between its different friendships in the Gulf and it's as well wanting, always looking forward to keep its relation with President Nasser a positive one, particularly that when there were an Arab issue on Kuwait, between Iraq and Kuwait, Nasser took a position really sided with Kuwait and sent troops then.
Professor, let me begin by saying that you have a very interesting life, fascinating life indeed. I mean, your father was a very well-known heart surgeon, was very close to the Kuwaiti royal family. You were born with a silver spoon in your mouth. How do you remember your childhood or pre-university life in Kuwait and the impact or the effect of your father? Did you have a kind of identity crisis being partly Palestinian, partly Kuwaiti? How did you handle that?
You see, these are difficult issues to handle for a young boy, but I think one aspect, Kuwait was open, and that openness allowed someone like me to handle these complex issues. I'll give you an example. I mean, my father was the doctor of the Crown Prince and the Emir, and he was a very successful cardiologist. And I remember, and I mentioned this in my book, Hayat Ghair Amina, published by As-Saqi in 2012 and again 2019.
Unsafe life.
Yes, unsafe life, or and that when I became Kuwaiti, I had a discussion with then the Crown Prince of Kuwait, or the first Prime Minister actually, Sheikh Sabah al-Salim, and in that discussion, I told him, "How come? What's going on?" Because you know, he was a very close friend to my father, and my father had a lot of respect for him, and so as a child at 9 years old, I just told him, "How come? I mean, we're going to go back to Palestine, aren't we? And so why do I need a Kuwaiti passport, or why do I need to become a naturalized Kuwaiti, or whatever? Or why do I need? And you're confusing me." I mean, he said, "No, you know." He was a very gentle man, and he had an impact on me, because we've had discussions over the years, and I will go more to the left, and I will become more radicalized in my thinking. And he's a very tolerant man. He would just take and give and listen. So he told me Kuwait and Palestine are one and the same. And once Palestine is back, you will go, and I'm going to go as well with you. And we're going to have a place there, and we're going to keep visiting. We're going to see, and you'll be between here and there. So don't consider this any betrayal. It's not like a betrayal to your identity and beliefs. You are Kuwaiti, you are Palestinian, you are Arab. We are all one and the same. I mean, that was the thrust. I'm not giving word for word. The thrust of his message to me, it relaxed me. And it made me very proud of how I can navigate. And I think since that conversation on, I has been able to navigate my identity as someone of a strong Palestinian background, that takes interest in the Palestine question, that does whatever he can in that context, and at the same time as a proud Kuwaiti who respects the country that has given me a certain place and has helped me in so many different ways, and on top, really tolerated my opinions and tolerated what I was doing later and what I was about to do after university.
What about the Kuwaiti society at large, not just the upper echelon? Did they also embrace you and your family?
You see, societies are diversified. This is what I will discover as I deal with identity. So you have you discover that half of Kuwait, and maybe more, are naturalized from Iranian background, Shia, Sunni, Iraqi background. So once you start realizing that your situation isn't any different than more than half of the population, and that they have issues and they discuss it. So yes, you will definitely, everybody is in their life are exposed to forms of racism, and but at the same time, I have been exposed to a lot of friendship and warmth, and And so that continued. And I think the more I read and the more I educated myself, which I think was the winning horse always, it allowed me to articulate the issue of identity in a much better way than just not really looking into what the literature says and what other people's experiences has been. So I think that side has helped me so much over the years, and therefore I survived, and I made others survive with me, and it worked. Though you get into issues at certain times, but the tolerance of the place has allowed me to at least fight these battles whenever warranted.
It is unique among the Gulf countries. Kuwait was unique among the Gulf countries.
Exactly.
They had parliament very early on, and they still have functioning one.
Kuwait was unique, and it is that uniqueness that allowed an environment, and it is that environment that hosted willingly the emergence of Fatah. You see, you look at it, I mean, it's not a coincidence. Arafat was in Kuwait, Abu Jihad was in Kuwait. It's not a coincidence Abu Iyad was in Kuwait. It's not a coincidence Abu al-Adib was in Kuwait. Not a coincidence that others, Khalid al-Hassan was in Kuwait, among others, and that they were meeting and they were having discussion. Definitely the Kuwaiti security knew about these discussions, and they were agree with it.
This was before joining American University in Beirut. By the way, why did you choose political science, not medicine, like your father? Could you talk more about the American University in Beirut in the early 70s? And especially it was a hub for Arab nationalism, also socialism. How do you describe Beirut back then?
Okay, I can describe Beirut because I went my last 2 years of high school, in addition to my earlier elementary, were in Beirut. Not in Beirut, we're in Brummana, but I would go to Beirut often. But I didn't go to the AUB. I went to Georgetown for my higher education, for my baccalaureate, for my BA. I mean, Beirut was, as I said earlier, an amazing, diversified place. And if you go to downtown Beirut, you'll hear all the taxis, you'll hear all the crowds, you'll hear all the noises, the people, the movement, the loud voices. That was downtown Beirut. Very, very, very Beiruti, very special to the Levant area, a very special place. And you will have the best falafel in the world, probably. And at the same time, you will have the most advanced then fashion on people, and you will have villagers coming from their villages with their traditional clothes, and nobody's bothering anybody else. I mean,
they used to call it the Switzerland of the Middle East.
And they used to call it the Switzerland of the Middle East. It was a very unique place. Sure, people here, I mean, women would hear comments here and there coming, but in a gentle way, in a way that is not, that doesn't carry the issues that it will carry later in different generations. And as a result, you just see all this coexistence, Christians, Muslims, everybody in this downtown Beirut. Go to Hamra, then you see all the intellectuals, all the writers, all the thinkers sitting in these cafes and having discussions with their students or with their friends or with their co-authors, etc. It was a vibrant, intellectual, human place that represented a hope for the Arab world. Unfortunately, this will not last, but there are always part of this will last. It's always part of Lebanon. That's why we still all love that place and feel towards it for what it has. So it was a unique place, yet it was a place for political movements. It was a place for Arab political movements, Lebanese political movements, Palestinian political movements. The Palestinian guerrillas by 69 administered all the refugee camps and had a presence in South Lebanon. It was a place for some of the best poets in the Arab world. You cannot give this poetry anywhere else. So from Nizar Qabbani to Mahmoud Darwish to all kinds of poetry that was and a lot of people who were given verdicts of execution in different Arab regimes after coup after coup after coup in Syria and Iraq and other places. The exiles are on the cafes of Beirut speaking about their experience and taking a break from their politics.
But this is also the time where Israel had a certain, I would call it terrorist operations against the leaders of the resistance at the time. 73, you were there, weren't you?
No, you see, I would
Kamal
go.
Udwan, Abu Yusuf al-Najjar.
Yes, but understood. There were terrorist attacks. They attacked once the Lebanese airport and destroyed all the Middle East airlines.
That's right.
69. So then I was in Brumana in my high school, but I left Lebanon and I left finished my high school and went to the US, went to a small junior college in the beginning. And then I moved to Georgetown University. So all these events later in the early 70s were happening. I was in Georgetown.
I see. What about Dr. Makram's question? Why political science? Why not pursuing medicine, for instance?
Yes, well,
that part of the environment that you lived in during your high school?
It's the environment. It's the trend of the time. It's I didn't want to be particularly focused on a particular subject that will take me away from the issues that I care about and from the passion that I carry towards the Palestine cause. And I felt studying political science was my passion, and I was reading all the time. So I wasn't reading medicine all the time. I was, you would go to a doctor.
Right. Yeah. And your dissertation was in the area of, was it Palestinians also in Kuwait?
That's way after Georgetown, because Georgetown was my baccalaureate. And then just to cut it short, I would stay in Georgetown, finish my BA political science. They called it government, actually, the official degree. And by 75, I will make a decision that was very complicated for my parents, for my family, for everybody who knew me in Kuwait, which is I decided to join the Palestinian movement and spent 6 years of my life in South Lebanon.
Wow. This is very, very actually.
This is.
I don't want to say
between 1975 and 1981, I was in South Lebanon, and therefore I was struck by all the politics that took place, the civil war in Lebanon, the Syrian intervention, and I decided to to become a militant, fully involved in actual combat and battalions in South Lebanon, on the premise that an intellectual should be involved and not leave the fight and not leave the struggle for the sons and for the daughters or for the peasantry of the more poorer segments of the Palestinian society, that everybody has a responsibility, an intellectual to believe in and to carry the beliefs that he or she believes in should really go to the grassroots. And therefore I said, I'm gonna indulge immediately in that context. And I went to South Lebanon, and it was a huge experience. Much of my book, Unsafe Life, Hayat Ghair Amina, is about that era. What happened? What kind of dialogue did we have? What did I learn from that experience?
Tell us in a few minutes, because this is fascinating. This is fascinating. This is a very important period in the life of the modern Lebanese society. This is where the whole thing became so polarized, with the Palestinian resistance being entrenched in Lebanon, which led to the 1982 invasion. Tell us about this, and tell us why you left also, and tell us what were the debates within the Palestinian movement at the time, where this is also after this so-called the 10 points plan, where they were looking for a state rather than for the complete liberation of Palestine.
This is very fascinating. When I look at Dr. Shafeeq, I always think of a thinker, an intellectual, but not a military leader, actually. So this brings me back to the questions of Dr. Sami. I'm very curious to know why you joined and why you left.
So basically, I joined because there was a high level of hope, and I was associated with a group of people. They were all within the Fatah movement, and they were on the left, meaning they wanted reform within the Palestine movement, but also they were mostly all university graduates and highly intellectual. Mu'in al-Tahir is one of them. You interviewed him.
You recall the names.
So I associated them. So Mu'in was my friend, but there were so many. I mean, Marwan Kayali, Ali Abu Tuq, Saad Abdul Qadir. Many died on the way.
Either martyrs or left the movement.
Yeah, Abu Khalid George, the brother of Munir Shafeeq. And we were attracted to what Munir Shafeeq also was saying. He was one of few in the Palestine movement that had at least some theoretical ideas to present. So we decided that we can form a structure. So the structure was formed through the student movement. We decided we could go beyond that and form a military group. And we had much help from people like Abu Hassan, who would Hamdi. I mean, Abu Hassan His. You see, I mean, these were a little bit older. Abu Hassan was older, a little bit older than us. We were all in our 20s, 21, 22, 23, maybe 24. But there were very few in their late 20s and early 30s who guided us as well. And so we formed a combat group known as the Sariya Tullabiya, the student brigade. And the student brigade became student brigades. And they became known for their courage, for their intellect, for their also human approach, political approach to dealing with people and populations and solving issues. And they were focused on the Palestine question. They were against the civil war in Lebanon. So I was attracted to that. They were composed of Muslims and Christians, Maronites, Sunnis, Shias. They were composed of a diversity, some Iraqis. I mean, Adil Abdel Mehdi was very close to that group in his early thinking. They had people from Syria. So it was so diversified, and at the same time focused on not getting involved in the civil war, though they will end up defending entire neighborhoods and areas in Lebanon during the civil war, but it was more a position of defense than a position of vengeance, hate, etc. They will defend areas, mountains, believing that that's a strategic defense in order to be able to go to South Lebanon. But that group wanted to be in the South, and it succeeded. The first early phase of the civil war, the first 18 months, they got involved, defended well. They fought in so many places, including Bahamdoun against the Syrian invasion. But the balance of power came to a point where their vision was correct. They wanted to go to South Lebanon, and they went. And the first place they were leading, they led in South Lebanon was Bint Jbeil and surrounding Maroun al-Ras, Aitarun, up to Saf al-Hawa and beyond, even Tibnin. So they had, that's where they stationed themselves. It was a very tough area to be in, very close to the Israeli borders. Saad Haddad was expanding, who was working with the Israelis and trying to control a security zone in South Lebanon. And that battalion, later called Jarmaq, but then it was still the students' battalion, really was able to protect that area fully. And I was the commander of Bint Jbeil from the beginning. And Mu'in was the leader of the battalion. We had different brigades within, and we managed well. And people loved the battalion because they opened up, they listened to people. They were not thugs. They protected the security of people. They protected people from theft and stealing, because there was anarchy as well. There were many militant groups. You don't know where they're coming from and what they belong to, who they belong to. And so you had to also do a lot of policing to support the population and to prevent anarchy. At the same time, fight the battle, and also be politically aware while you fight the battle. You try not to hit civilian areas in the Christian side or in other areas around. You try to get a message to the other side that if you don't want to do that, so they don't hit your civilian population areas. You try to create order within anarchy. At the same time, you fight the battle for Palestine, and you do very serious operations. And we stayed there for several years.
And yet you had to leave. You had to make a decision to leave.
So the question of leaving, you see, because we're talking about 6 years.
Yes.
And 6 years takes us through quite a lot of events. So you look at, I go there in 75, and then I spent time with a group called Nusur al-Arqub in South Lebanon. But then I joined the student brigades. The student brigades does a wonderful job. We are all in solidarity with each other, and we're in solidarity with the population in South Lebanon after we moved to South Lebanon. But then, you see, in 77, the Sadat, Camp David, 78, 79. Then in 77, Begin becomes prime minister. Yes. Then in 78, 79, you get the Islamic Revolution in Iran. 79, You see, so Egypt, our back, has, I mean, the entire Arab world. This is where your strength in the background is now crumbling, is changing. The Lebanese are not seeing any more light at the end of the tunnel. They started to see that the Palestinian existence in South Lebanon, or presence in South Lebanon, is permanent. It's not like there is a Palestinian state soon. It doesn't feel anymore that there is a state coming, that there is settlements, but there isn't a state, and that the conflict is going to go higher and higher and higher. And that the Palestinian presence is a heavy presence as well. So people in the South Lebanon started looking very negatively to the movement, whether to the Lebanese nationalist movement or to the Palestinian nationalist movement. They still trusted the battalion. They still would wanted to be the protector, but they didn't trust anybody else. And so South Lebanon wasn't in a healthy situation by 79, 80. 78, Israel's invasion in South Lebanon, which I participated in the fight, and I was then commanding Bint Jbeil, and still we fought for 8 days, 7 days continuously. But at the end, we lost a big chunk of South Lebanon to the Israeli occupation, and the only one became the Salah ad-Din castle, the Shkif castle, next to Arnoun, and that's where we got stationed, and I was commanding that area as well for more than a year and a half. And it is in that area that the struggle goes on from South Lebanon, but yet we became limited, realizing that from this corner now we're not going to change a lot of events. But the Islamic Revolution made a big impact, an impact that it is going to support.
Yeah, tell us about that.
On the one hand, but an impact that people started ideologically changing. So if you were in the left, you became in the Islamic side. And if you were still in the left, you're now becoming isolated. And if you, so Islam is the solution became the story, the trend of the time. And then suddenly the hijabs all over Lebanon. They weren't one in Beirut. You would see, I mean, you go in my area, in the neighborhood I would go to often. I mean, that's it. And then suddenly it's every place. There was a hijab revolution. There was, etc. I think it could confuse many young people. It had an impact on their thinking, and they were not sure anymore. You were under the banner of an ideology that was more nationalist, more secular. Now people are moving to Islamic banners, and new trends are coming. New groups are emerging. Beginning of Hezbollah, for instance, where I remember vividly. I mean, Raghib Harb and Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, whom I had a friendship with, and more with his father, actually, because they lived in Bint Jbeir. So I knew them very well. And so I would listen to a totally different ideology, different setup. You had to re-educate yourself all over again. I think it's in that vacuum, that several of my comrades decided it's time to move on. So several left, and I was among them. I decided maybe it's time for me to go do my PhD studies and look at things from different perspectives, maybe the same or different, or I need to learn more. And I think in 81, by April, May, June, this is the time I left, and I went to the US and started a PhD, my PhD program.
And before we move on to the other parts, tell me about the political goals of the resistance at the time. Because this, obviously, Al-Katiba Tullabiyya, the student battalion, wasn't buying into this fact that we can, the Niqat al-Ashr, the 10-point plan. They really more wanted to go and to the original idea of the liberation of ideologically they were a bit different. Did you see, I was suspecting that perhaps you were disappointed at the leadership that was leading this movement, and you thought, we are not doing much progress, so I can go and be part of a different struggle, the academic side or thing. Tell us about what were the debates within the Fatah groups at the time, within the close circle to Yasser Arafat. Did it evolve, or did they at the time decided that, we're going to go to the negotiating route, which led to Oslo, or this something came very slowly over the years?
It came slowly over the years.
I would like also to add a point. I know that you were very close to Munir Shafeeq, and most probably this reminds me with what you were saying about the shift in the mentality and from the left, extreme left to the right, to Islam, and the changes that were in the Fatah and the PLO leadership. So in a way, it's the same question. But I would like you to highlight that relation with Munir Shafeeq, especially with his pivotal role in the student brigade.
So you see, Abu Fadi had a lot of respect. Munir Shafeeq had a lot of respect within the student brigades, and that group. That group also had an impact. In Tripoli, Lebanon, in South Lebanon, in Sidon, in the mountains of Lebanon, it had groups that believed in it. Yes, with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Munir Shafeeq went more into Islam and declared that he's Muslim compared to his Christian background. And a lot of dialogue took place between different components. But the actual result was that people were pragmatic as well. And as a result of that, you ended up with several trends, not one. So some stayed as they are. Others went to Islam as an ideology that can move the grassroots population of Palestine and the region to fight for the cause of Palestine. And some saw it as an ideology that works for the conditions of the Arab world, rather than a Marxist ideology that is alien to the mentality of the Arab world. So here the world, God and Islam and Mustadafin and etc. makes a big difference in even recruiting populations and bringing people around a certain slogan. So I think we had different trends going on, but at the same time, that was a vacuum. And the vacuum, Iran could not fill that vacuum immediately, at least. And it's a further away. It's a more distant country. And at the same time, that vacuum created all kinds of discussions of which, yes, so people started to realize that they need time to think, they need time. We've agreed on a line, and there was consensus. The consensus has been broken. Now people are going to reposition themselves in different ideological or political positions. And it's that repositioning that really was the vacuum era. So it was normal between 1980 and 81, particularly in 81, to see individuals of high caliber, important fighters, leading fighters within the Jarmaq battalion, deciding that it's time to move on and cannot stick any longer. And it started with the Lebanese group within our group. They were the first to start moving. And I think one of the issues was that there was the Iraq-Iran war. You see, you look at the regional context, we all are victimized by it and we're affected by it. The Iraq-Iran war. So Iraq represents the Ba'ath and the secular movement, fine. And then Iran represents the Islamic Revolution. So Saddam attacks Iran. But what happens in South Lebanon? Those who support Iran rally around Iran and rally around that Iran should not be treated this way by Iraq. And those who support Iraq, Jabhat Tahrir al-Arabiya, the Arab Popular Front, the Ba'athists in South Lebanon and in Lebanon, would go into direct conflict with the Shias of Lebanon. Harakat Amal was on the rise, not Hezbollah then. And Harakat Amal, the Amal movement, also became very aggressive in its stand against the Palestinian presence in South Lebanon. So you started to realize that there is a big vacuum, that the people are not anymore. Then
Dr. Shafeeq, because
welcoming the movement, and there's so much conflict, and as a result of that, the Jarmaq battalion started to become a peacemaker by positioning its troops to make sure there is a ceasefire between the Ba'ath, the Arab Liberation Front, some members of Fatah also, among others in the Palestinian movement, and Harakat Amal, the Amal movement. And that's when some of the individuals here started to raise doubt. We have not come to South Lebanon to prevent internal fighting. We have come to South Lebanon to focus on one matter. So I think a big vacuum from many sides. You add to it Egypt's position, you add to it the Arab world, you add to it the Iraq war, you add to it the situation in Lebanon. It really was coming to an end. But 1982 is the decision by the Israelis to bring it in that context. They wanted to claim. I mean, they want it was things were weakening, but they wanted to claim that they are the ones who did it. That's what Begin and Sharon wanted, and they made the situation much more worse for Lebanon and for the region and for themselves.
I want to engage you in several questions, and we have 25 minutes left. So I'd like to start, for the 40 years, we stopped at 82, you went to the United States, you got your master's degree, you got your PhD, you went to Kuwait, you became very prominent political scientist you established departments, universities, higher education. You're also a keen observer of what's going on throughout the region. I mean, we've gone through a lot. We come to Oslo, where the Palestinian Authority basically is born, and they capitulate to many of the conditions that they were put under. And then we go through 25 years of basically meaningless negotiations. So I wanted to reflect upon from two perspectives, one from the perspective of an academic who was keen on establishing institutions, and one from a keen political observer and participant in this, where we are in the Palestinian struggle. Do you see things evolving in a positive direction or a negative direction from your perspective?
Well, you see, the origins of Oslo probably started in the 10 points. But then my position, among many others, there was an idea that why quarrel over a Palestinian state that may not happen? Mm-hmm. So this is the position, was just keep struggling, keep doing the right thing. But after 82, then you get the first intifada. But before that, you get the war of the camps. You get all kinds of the Tripoli conflict with the Syrians, the So there were many stages in the Palestinian movement trying to reestablish its position in Lebanon, but it did not work out. What I see is that with Oslo, keep in mind it happened after 1990-91. It happened when there were more than 500,000 troops, American troops, in the Arab world, and in the Gulf in particular. And when
where were you during the 1990 invasion? Were you in Kuwait?
I was in Kuwait. I witnessed it for 3 months, and then I left Kuwait. I got smuggled out of Kuwait, and I joined in Washington the efforts of Kuwait to support its liberation. And I owed this to Kuwait, and I worked very hard in that context, that Kuwait should be liberated, that Kuwait should get back to where it was before 1990, that what Saddam did was not occupy 5 miles of the borders of Kuwait, which could have been negotiated like any border issue, but that Saddam erased the capital of Kuwait and annexed an entire country. That wasn't easy for anybody to accept. Not only Kuwaitis, but quite a big chunk of the Arab world or the Arab systems or the world as well. I mean, look at the decisions that came then. So I was there and I witnessed it. But at the same time, what I want to say is that after 1990, 91, you have an entire different political environment. Right. And it's in that context, I think, Arafat was at his weakest point, that he accepted Oslo, and maybe he had ideas how he can turn the table, and still he will be in Palestine and he can do something. He had these ideas, I'm assuming, and I believe he had. But at the same time, that put him on a certain road that has later on deteriorated further with other leaders, such as Abu Mazen, among others. So it's now a complex situation. I think the Fatah generation that created the revolution from 1965, even the military, the different militant groups that emerged, Popular Front, Democratic Front, I mean, it's coming to a close, or it's coming to a certain dead end. I think the environment in Palestine is open, and in the Palestinian diaspora is open for new trends. We're in a vacuum again. I mean, it goes in a vacuum every 10 years. Yes. Like 48, after 48, there was a big vacuum. After the 36, 39 revolution in Palestine was a vacuum until the late 40s. So 50s was a vacuum. 60s, Fatah Kam. Now there is a vacuum. It reminds me of what happened after 48. So people are searching for answers, searching for new ideas, how to continue the struggle. Today in Palestine, there is an apartheid. And there is a Zionist apartheid. I mean, blocking the population and circling, sieging. Look at Gaza, blocked and sieged from all sides. Look at the Palestinians in the West Bank. They can't move. They can't even go to the Aqsa. They can't even, I mean, to travel is complicated. To go from one city to the other, roads for Jews and Israelis and roads for Arabs, different areas for, it's necropolitics. It's biopolitics at its highest level. It's an apartheid, prison sentences, marginalization, unemployment, forcing the population to leave slowly, increments, by making the life so hard for the Palestinians of the West Bank or for the Palestinians of Jerusalem. And at a less intensity, but still at a certain level, you have the same experience for Palestinians in 1948 Palestine. So the Palestinian dilemma has not been solved. It's still there. And searching for answers is still there, is even stronger than ever before, but at the hands of a new generation who's turning now 20 and 24 and 25 and 28 and wants to live happily, but wants to live under a just system, wants to have national rights, wants to have political rights, wants to make sure that they can move freely, like all the peoples of the world who experience freedom. And therefore,
Professor,
this is where I think we're ready. We're ready. And I look at what happened in Jerusalem a few days ago. We're ready. It just will happen. Now, 5 years, but we're ready. We're there, I think.
Professor, what's the way out? Many Palestinians seem to be very pessimistic when it comes to the possibility of having an independent Palestinian state. Some of them even started deliberating the idea of what is called the one-state solution, where Israelis and Palestinians would live peacefully side by side. What's your opinion in this regard? How would the future of the Palestinian struggle, how would it be?
I do realize that the Palestinian state is a very difficult, if not impossible task at this stage. I mean, you have 750, 800,000 settlers between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. All I see now is the right of people for justice, national and political rights, the right of people to live happy and to live in a just system. And that means apartheid in Palestine, racism in Palestine, discrimination in Palestine, marginalization in Palestine should stop. Now, that means another 30 years, I see it, of struggle to bring down the apartheid regime in the way it is expressing itself in Palestine. That means another long ground of confrontation with Zionism being the fruit, being the helm, being the center of apartheid in Palestine.
Yes.
And so no need to come up. I mean, solutions will present themselves. One state, federal, confederacy. We all live in I mean, we're not talking here about the Israeli population, whether they should stay or go. This is, we've gone beyond that discussion. I realize there are 6 million plus Israeli Jews in Palestine. It's not on my thinking that they should leave.
Hasn't it always been like this? I mean,
Palestinians
did not fight people. They did not fight Jews. They fought the system, Zionism.
It's the system.
So it is the same question since 1948. What is
not exactly, doctor, not exactly. You know, because I think we were influenced under Fatah, regardless of the slogans. In the 60s, with the Algerian model. Keep in mind, Abu Jihad went to Algeria. Everybody was impressed by the Algerian model, where the settlers will ultimately leave. Now we're more closer to, and don't say identical to the South African model.
I had Dr. Ilan Pape with us a few days ago, and this point came up, and he thinks, of course, that the Zionism is I told him if Zionism will ever reconcile having Palestinians there, and he said, no, they don't, you know, as you do. And then he says that when this crumbles, when it comes to the point where the whole state might either collapse or recede, he thinks that many Israelis would just pack and go. He thought that only few would remain.
That's freedom of choice.
Yeah.
You know, many South Africans, white South Africans left.
That's right. Exactly.
But they have the right to go back. They still have their property. They still can go and come. But many of them are all over the world. But that's fine if you feel you've lost your privileges and you can't tolerate it. But there are other South Africans who lost these privileges and are more than happy to work for the development of South Africa.
But the difference, of course, is that we have also 7 million Palestinians, where the overwhelming majority of them want to come back. And these would not be tolerated, because once they are allowed to go back, I mean, Jews will not go. I mean, you have as many Jews in Israel now. I don't think any more Jews will come, but you still have about 7 million Palestinians. If they come, then they become, you know, that's the theory, is that it would be very difficult for them to accept, you know, that they would become a minority within this. So they will either fight to the last nail, or they would have to leave. And I know I'm curious how you think about that, about the right of return. And
the way I think, yes, the way I think about it is that when you really go beyond the discrimination on the ground, things could open up for all kinds of discussions, for all kinds of solutions. You look at the South Africa model. It was one of the founders of their militant wing, their armed struggle wing, who was white. He is the one who was able to negotiate a lot of aspects with the white South Africans and the generals. Solutions present themselves. Now, when you have a population like the Palestinians, there is a big diaspora, return may mean different things. First, you get the right. So, as you said, I mean, you know, people get the right, but then they decide. Not everybody will come back, but there were those who are under stress would want to come back. Not everybody will give up the duality that they are in. But you see, let me just give you an example. I mean, I visited Palestine in 2012, 2013, and 2016. And I found my grandfather's house. And I would want to have the right to maybe create a memorial around that house.
In Haifa?
My grandfather from my mother's side. In
from
Haifa, I found where my father worked as a doctor, which is the oil company, the refinery. I want to have the right to visit. I have to want to right. So my right of return may be visit, stay long as I want, come and go, write, research. Maybe someone else is to commemorate a memory of their town, maybe rebuild their town. Maybe others don't want to do that or don't have the means for that. I think there are many ways to look at it and many ways to solve it if a human dimension and paradigm prevails. And this will not prevail without a long struggle and without the Israelis realizing that they cannot get rid of the Palestinian people.
Dr. Shafeeq, before I asked Dr. Makram to give you the last question, I wanted to reflect a little bit about ideologies within the Arab world. At one point we have the leftist groups, then we have the Islamist groups. Now we're having basically the post that, particularly after the setback of the Arab Spring. How do you see the state of the ideologies within the Arab context? Do you see there are more? I mean, at one point in Beirut, particularly, there was this harmony taking place between, what's called Makram Balawi al-Islami, those who are the Arab nationalists on the Islamic side, and they're trying to come together and look beyond the ideology for what they have in common. And now we're back to the situation where, Islam or Islamic movements are being demonized, and where the left basically has dissipated or disintegrated. So where do you see the future of ideology in the Arab world, and particularly the movement toward democracy?
So in the Arab world, we have two trends now racing, competing against each other, maybe in a positive way. We have a reform trend that wants to see democracy develop. That reform trend exists in so many Arab countries. Some of it is seen. The more open places, you can see that reform trend. And then more closed places, you can see that the reform trend is in the prison or is in exile. Or you can see a combination of all in many countries. That's on the one hand. And you have movements in the street. You have movements in the culture. You have movements going on even in novels and writings all over the Arab world. So there is a spirit here of reform that believes that you can change the reality into a more democratic, reform-oriented. And there are some members of the elite, but they're the minority. They're very few, and they're marginalized elites. So you get elites, ruling elites, but you get a member who is reform-minded. And people look at this kind of elite as a hope for the reform. But then, on the other hand, there is a revolutionary trend. The Arab world, for the first time in a long time, I see revolutionary trends. I see people who have definitely made the decision that they're going to go head on head for a revolution, for a radical change, to build a state and a country. And that revolutionary trend is maturing, is evolving. All of this has the roots in 2011, 2012, 2010, the Arab Spring. So now we're in the middle of all of that. So there is a revolutionary ideology, and from discussions and dialogues for younger people, you realize that is a strong ideology, and it is maturing and evolving. And some of them began to write and develop ideas and etc. So it's a process. But also there is a reform trend that want to make changes peacefully, that want to ally with certain elites, the wings in the elites that are the more connected to the population, rather than the wings of the elites that are more stubborn in its relation with the population. And you get these two trends. Now, if the reform trend, if the Arab regimes continue to put people in jail, to stop reform, to deny reform, to promise and do nothing, and too much corruption, too much monopolization, the privatization by itself that made more people poor, this neoliberalism in all its entirety, had created so much unemployment and poverty in the Arab world. If this trend comes, I promise you, the Arab world will become a revolutionary center of the globe. And you will get revolutions, meaning more classical, maybe more negotiated, but more radical revolutions will take place.
Before again, the last question to Dr. Makram, this is true when it comes to perhaps what's going on the ground. But in terms of ideologies, do you see now we're post-ideological trends that now people care more about performance and about results than about ideologies? Particularly, does secularist forces, secularist trends reconcile with the role of Islam in society? And are Islamists now willing to give more or listen more to the other liberal sides of society? Do you see this, are they conforming, coming together, or are we at the point where ideology doesn't matter anymore?
I think they are conforming, coming together on the basis of justice, equality, freedom, rights. These are ideology as well. This is ideology, and it's an ideology that is making people move and consider their dilemmas. So they are coming together. Yet there is a style of liberals who are totally isolated from the social context, who are looking on narrow definitions of what liberalism is, which is more personal freedom, while they are not tackling at all the political side. So I think the liberals I'm talking about, who are coming along with post-Islamists and with Islamists and others, are the ones that believe in the social context, in justice, in equality, in addressing the issues of the population. Our populations have gone from sizable middle classes to larger sections of poverty and a situation of with Corona has become very complicated, and therefore people's dilemmas, I think, in the coming 2 to 3, 4 years are going to be far more exaggerated, and it will explode given the dilemmas they face on the ground. I mean, you look at unemployment among youth, you look at what happened in Syria, you look at Iraq, you look at some of the Gulf countries, you look at Jordan, you look at Algeria, you look at Libya, you look at Morocco, there are dilemmas. And if these dilemmas are not addressed within a framework of reform that is democratic, but at the same level, able to build a stronger state and able to deal with the issues of the time, things will explode. And the potential is definitely there, but it's also definitely there in Palestine, because the level of repression is one of the highest anywhere on this
Final
globe.
question to Dr. Makram.
Yeah, sir. It was very interesting discussion. Actually, I have more than 12 questions. I was able to ask.
We have to invite Dr. Shafeeq later for these questions. Just choose
inshallah. But yet, as an intellectual, how do you see the relationship between power, Arab states, and knowledge, Arab intellectuals and academics? And we have an example nowadays that is normalization. We find a lot of intellectuals who are just justifying normalization with Israel, and in a very actually unacceptable way. I don't want to put it in another way. How do you comment on this?
But you see, I mean, you look at what an intellectual is to be critical, but also to look at the other side, to look at other critical opinion, and to look even to dig into the truth, to dig into reality. If we look at Foucault's excavations, digging. So the intellectuals you're talking about are not digging. They're taking orders from the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Communication, and just so in a way, you really look deeper. They've lost their intellectual status. Many of them have lost their popularity in society. If you look at the majorities in these societies, they're against normalization. It's not normalization, actually. It's really an alliance. It's an alliance against other states. It's an alliance that could take us into wars. It's an alliance that has technological side, that has investments, that has, etc. And this alliance is shaping itself on the reality of apartheid in Palestine. Mm-hmm. So when what happened in Jerusalem happened, many were afraid. They wanted to stop. They wanted to stop immediately because it exposes. And I think a movement in Palestine will expose much of this. Will expose Zionism, but will expose as well the settlements and what's going on in Jerusalem and in Palestine at large. So I see limited impact, in fact, limited. But you see, when a state supports a certain intellectual, well, we have that in the Syrian Iraqi model historically. They support one intellectual, and he just takes orders from the state, and he is thought to be, becomes like a balloon. But it's a very weak one. It's not real. And I think we're having intellectuals today who are deeper into art, music, culture, film. We're having intellectuals who are deeper into the entire political situation and independent and not taking orders from anybody, and able to articulate the stories and the issues and the challenges of which the people of the Middle East, the people of the Arab world are suffering from daily. I mean, you can't imagine how deep the suffering is. Just look at a boat that carries 100 people and the willingness of them to all die just to get to Greece or to get to Cyprus or to get to any Western country. Just look at the suffering and you realize something huge will happen without us ever being able to decide when it will happen or noticing that it is already in process.
Thank you so much for this very rich, illuminating, and wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it tremendously, and I hope to invite you again in the future.
Yeah. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to both of you, and thank you. And here we meet across the globe and the space. Look forward to meeting you in person soon.
I wish you the best, and thank you, Dr. Makram, for being part.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you.
And for tomorrow's guest, we are going to have Dr. Norman Finkelstein, very well known, of course, for his books on Palestine, on the conflict, and we're going to engage him in a discussion on these issues that we discussed about today, as well as his views on Zionism and the future of the conflict. And with me would be SIGA Research Fellow, Mr. Ubaid Roof, inshallah. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'll see you tomorrow.